Why has the Western mainstream news media fallen apart? Various reasons have been offered. Is it a leftist media bias? Is it the influence of cultural Marxism from U.S. academia? Is it an unforeseen impact from U.S. wealth disparities? Is it foreign influence, such as funding from despotic countries like Saudi Arabia? Is it the negative influence of social identity politics? Is it the hatred bred by outrage culture? The answer is actually quite simple, but it influences all of the aforementioned. To put it simply, the Western mainstream media is broke. Completely broke. To understand the depth and scope of this particular problem and its present-day influence, I'd like to read the first few paragraphs of a review of two books written by journalists in the profession who witnessed the meltdown of the news media organizations firsthand throughout their careers. The review is from Foreign Affairs, a well-established and respected U.S. foreign policy think tank that provides policy proposals and suggestions to various departments of the White House for topics chiefly related to supporting the national interests of the United States. Throughout the years, the Internet's impact on democracy, both domestically within the U.S. and across the world, has become increasingly important for a multitude of reasons, especially after the last presidential election here in the U.S. This particular review, titled Bad News, is by Jacob Weisberg, and you can see his credentials on screen. I believe Weisberg explains the ills of the news media in a clear and concise manner. So, without further ado, let's start. In 2004, an ordinary, healthy year for the newspaper business, the Washington Post earned $143 million in profit. 5 years later, in 2009, the paper lost $164 million amid a shift from paid print to free digital consumption, the erosion of its classified and local advertising businesses, and the global financial crisis. The collapse of its business model forced round after round of cutbacks, staff buyouts, and layoffs. That year, the Post shut all its domestic reporting bureaus outside the Washington area, including those in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. The Post position was typical of the country's healthiest newspapers. That same year, the New York Times, facing possible bankruptcy, sold most of the new headquarters building into which it had just moved and arranged a $250 million high-interest loan from the Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim. Around the country, more vulnerable papers closed down and put themselves up for sale. With few exceptions, the great family-owned franchises were being gobbled up by private equity firms with little sense of civic obligation and even less understanding of journalism. In the years since, the profession of journalism has contracted and grown ever more precarious. Between 2008 and 2017, employment among newspaper journalists fell by nearly half. In 2018, the Pew Research Center reported that the median annual income of newsroom employees with a college degree was around $51,000, about 14% less than the median for all other college-educated workers. 20 years ago, public relations specialists outnumbered journalists by a ratio of less than 2 to 1. Today, the ratio is more than 6 to 1. According to Fortune, the only professions losing jobs more rapidly than newspaper reporter are letter carrier, farmer, and meter reader. Those who remain at media organizations feel themselves losing status and credibility. Last year, a Gallup Knight Foundation survey found that 69% of Americans had lost trust in the news media over the previous decade. For Republicans, the figure was 94%. Now, that is as far as I'll go. The review article itself goes on to the history of journalism in the U.S. and goes on to what kind of business models are operating nowadays. The short of it is that the business models that exist nowadays require expected losses in revenue just to stay afloat and have more narrow focus in what news they really discuss. Many who live in the U.S. may have noticed that a lot of the mainstream news outlets now seem to focus a unjustified amount of attention on presidential elections, even like 3 years before the next election cycle. There's more that goes on in life and in human affairs than the presidential election, regardless of how important it is. But unfortunately, right now, the news that's selling and keeping the Western mainstream media afloat in this day and age is whatever produces outrage, because outrage sells. This is, of course, unfortunate. I hope that this provides a clear picture as to what has been going on. We generally try to find reasons for why a particular group is acting in a very biased manner, but for some reason, it seems like most people just don't focus on the money, the financial situation that a lot of these news media organizations are in. And to be honest, considering the loss of manpower and the loss of focus on important local news that is just not being discussed anymore, that even independent media organizations, try as they might, probably cannot cover due to lack of manpower and finances. We should probably start to seriously think over how we view the mainstream news media as a society, because just regardless of subscription payments, which to me seems like gated communities where you have to pay just to learn more about what is going on in the world, which is the opposite of how it has been, with everyone being able to freely read whatever they like as far as news sources are concerned. Regardless of that, it's not feasible for them to be able to cover any serious local news anymore, and it is highly unlikely that they will change due to the current business models that are operating, and the fact that they really cannot make any money anymore off of what we would consider the old style of more credible journalism. And given that this is the situation now, I think we as a public should be more skeptical about the credibility of the Western mainstream media. I really hate to say that. I had hoped that they would be able to turn themselves around, because not knowing what is credible in the media anymore is dangerous. It leaves us more vulnerable to fake news, to outrage, to lies spread in the public discourse. But you can see it with how they treat Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump makes a show of himself, really. But even despite that, they are not focusing on fact-based information quite honestly, their credibility has been dying for many years for Americans who have been paying attention. As far back as 2003, where they lied about weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein supposedly held, which they never really acknowledged or apologized for, regarding news that they had essentially lied to the American public about. And that was a betrayal that I think many of us could never forgive. Their actions against Occupy Wall Street, which was a genuine protest, shut down. And when it was shut down by the police, none of the mainstream news media outlets paid attention to the fact that it was a violation of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And I know because I checked. I could not believe, personally, when not a single one of them pointed out this very basic fact of what happened. The same thing happened again with the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and quite honestly, do they really deserve to be considered credible anymore? I feel like I'm judging based on the facts as I've experienced them throughout my life. We can't expect the Western mainstream media to get better. It'll just become more toxic, more extreme, and it's only gotten worse and worse. The point of all this being that I hope to better inform people who are wondering what the hell has been going on with the Western mainstream media and why it took such a nosedive. This is basically the gist of it. I'm sure there's more in-depth analyses that could happen on this topic, but as far as a clear understanding of the general events that have been going on, I hope this has helped to clarify that much, because in this day and age, I feel it is more important to try to stay as informed as possible, and to be sure that the knowledge you have is actually the truth of the matter. And it's honestly getting harder to do that. So I hope this has been at least a little bit helpful.